Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the 10 best recordings of the late Bernard Haitink. Now, of course, this is my view of the 10 best. You may have a different 10 best, but I think this is probably a wonderful sample of his artistry. Haitink was an interesting conductor. His range actually wasn't that wide. He didn't do much classical repertoire. He wasn't particularly successful as a Beethoven conductor. He didn't do, opera. I mean, he did record a lot of operas at one point. He was at Covent Garden, but he wasn't an exciting operatic conductor, even though he did like a ring cycle. Does anybody care? No, nobody cares. It's really kind of fascinating. He was a specialist in the late Romantic and early 20th century repertoire. That's what he did. The other question that's really quite fascinating is, to what extent does he owe his popularity and his success to the fact that he was early on given the gift of leadership of the Concertgebouw Orchestra, an orchestra that was, initially at least, far greater than he was. It really was. Indeed, the story goes that he wanted to do a Beethoven cycle, but the Concertgebouw people wouldn't let him because they didn't feel he was ready for it. And so he made it in London, where he was director of the London Philharmonic. That was his first Beethoven cycle. And as everybody knows, it wasn't very successful at all. They had a point. He matured with the Concertgebouw Orchestra, which he led for decades. And then after he left, he spent the rest of his career, more or less, as a principal guest conductor and doing various things with various different orchestras, but re-recording a lot of the stuff that he had done initially in Amsterdam, only not as well. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And one of the things that always, sort of annoyed me, frankly, about Haitink was that he gave an interview once, and I've talked about this before, about the glut of Mahler recordings, where he said, well, Mahler should be, a composer for special occasions, and there are too many Mahler recordings, and people shouldn't do them so frequently. And then he spent the rest of his life doing the same things over and over and over again, including Mahler. I mean, there was Mahler in Amsterdam and in everywhere else, in Chicago or in Bavarian Radio in Munich, and the same thing with Bruckner. No horses, though, because his Bruckner was always quite good. So we don't have to worry about the stampede coming in from the barnyard when we talk about Haitink's Bruckner. But it really was a case of he was doing the same things with different orchestras over and over and over and over. And so in order to get the best of Haitink, you have to be very selective of things that quite often he did elsewhere. And it's perhaps not a mystery that a lot of the things that I think represent his best work are pieces that he did not record more than once. They were one-offs, and they were fabulous one-offs. And maybe he knew too. He just had a sense of what some of his best stuff was, and he just didn't want to do it again, which I think probably was quite wise. He had a reputation as being kind of dour and cranky. I actually had a girlfriend who was Dutch, whose uncle used to brag about the fact that they used to beat him up on the playground when they were in high school together or in grammar school when they were kids in Holland. I had a little bit of an in there. I don't know. I don't want to disparage the man, especially since he recently passed away. He made a great many marvelous recordings, and here are 10 of them. They really are excellent, and I think that they illustrate the range of what he could do extremely, extremely well. So let's get right to it. And remember that there are sound clips, too, at the bottom of this little chat, so feel free to sample some of the pieces that I talked about for your delectation. First, Bruckner. He did tons of Bruckner. Haitink did way too much Bruckner. And especially like so many conductors, as they get older, they tend to do Bruckner because I guess the tempos are always slow. and you don't have to worry about things like your blood pressure going up too high or your pulse racing whenever you do Bruckner. This is the 1978, that's the date on the back of the CD tray, Bruckner 7th. Now, he did Bruckner 7th a bunch of times. 3 or 4, maybe? maybe more. But this was the best. It's with the Concertgebouw, and it's just marvelous. Was his second recording with the Concertgebouw, but the date is significant. 1978. Yes, that's what it says here. 1978. 1978 was just before Philips started making digital recordings. And as was true of most of the major labels, not labels like Telarc that were always sort of audiophile, but just the major labels that later became Universal, their initial digital recordings sucked. They were horrible, just horrible. And right after this was like one of the last analog recordings they made. And their analog recordings, Philips finally learned how to put bass into their recordings. They were gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. And then it all went to hell for the first, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 years of digital recording. And Haitink remade a lot of his Bruckner digitally with the Concertgebouw, and it did not sound very good. But this seventh is the most glowing, beautiful Bruckner seventh he ever did, and one of the most beautiful recordings of the Concertgebouw I ever heard. And it's simply fantastic, with a slow movement, an adagio that will absolutely transport you into other realms. It's incredibly beautiful, and definitely one of his greatest recordings. Another recording he made, which I don't think gets as much credit as it deserves, but which has never been equaled by anybody else, was his recording of the Brahms 2 Serenades. Here it is, Serenades 1 and 2. It's in the little book of his Brahms recordings generally, which includes also the piano concertos with Claudio Arrau and the violin concerto, the double concerto. Those are all very good with Heinrich Schering and Janos Starker. The symphonies are kind of dull. They're just not that thrilling. They're not terrible, but they're a little heavy, a little thick, like I said, he could be dour, and his Brahms is a little dour. So was his Schumann. It was terrible. But the Serenades, the 2 pieces of Brahms, the orchestral pieces that don't get played very often and maybe need a little bit of special pleading because they're early works, that's the kind of stuff, underdog music that he could just do fabulously. First of all, he had one of the great orchestras in the world. And second of all, his sincerity and his musicality just worked to the advantage of these pieces that don't get as much credit as they deserve and aren't heard that often and need a little bit of special pleading. And the Brahms 2 Serenades are 2 of those pieces. And my God, there is no more beautiful recording of the Serenades in existence than this one, with Haitink and the Concertgebouw, now on Decca. So that's one of the great ones. What do we have next? Oh, yes. Another wonderful, wonderful disc, and another piece that you might not think about. Bizet, Symphony in C, coupled with Jeu d'Enfant. This is on Australian Eloquence, and coupled with the Saint-Saëns Organ Symphony with Edo de Wart, the San Francisco Symphony, which is also great. But this Bizet Symphony in C is so beautiful. It is such a marvelous performance, particularly because you have the incredible wind section of the Concertgebouw, which is always amazing, but also just the most crisp, elegant, tasteful, again, the sheer musicality, the songfulness, everything about this piece. Such a wonderful little symphony. It doesn't get perhaps as much attention as it deserves because it's an early immature work and all that stuff, and it's such a great piece. And Haitink treats it like the best music in the world, and that's how they play it. So that's an absolutely fabulous disc. His Bizet Symphony is amazing. His French music generally is kind of underrated, and we're going to talk about quite a bit of it. Next, from Haitink's London Philharmonic period, there is not a lot that I think is wonderful. There was a very, very fine Scheherazade. Some of these things are quite hard to find now. A very, very good Scheherazade, a very, very good, what was it? The Holst, the Planets. He took some of these war horses and did beautiful, beautiful work with them. And it would not surprise me, now that he's dead, of course, if Decca does a whole series of, Haitink, the LPO years, and then the Concertgebouw years, or then the other years, or the years from elsewhere. That kind of stuff begins to happen. He's had a couple big boxes come out. There's a Symphony edition, and then there's like a Philips Years edition. They've done them. But, it's been a few years, and now that he's gone, it's probably time to do them again. So keep your eye out. But in the meantime, I think from the LSO period, one of his very greatest records was this recording of the Liszt two piano concertos and the best ever Totentanz with Alfred Brendel. And Brendel was a good Liszt pianist. You know, he wasn't not the kind of guy you normally would think would be great for Liszt, but he had that devilishness in him. And he also, Liszt is not the kind of composer where you need to have a gorgeous tone. You know, Brendel's tone was always kind of brittle, but it's okay, and it works fabulously well. The Totentanz is amazing, and the two of them are just totally on it. They dig into it and play the living daylights out of it. A piece that does not ask for any subtlety at all, and you wouldn't think that that would be in Haitink's wheelhouse. But again, he could surprise you. He gets behind these pieces that need that extra effort, and he always delivers the goods in them. And so for Totentanz, this is the disc. And of course, the two piano concertos are marvelous too. They really are. But it's the Totentanz that makes the disc. Totally fantastic. And this is the only thing from Haitink's LPO phase that I'm including in this list of his best recordings. Remember, he did all the Liszt tone poems. They were a little dull. He didn't have quite the eccentricity that music required. But here, he did. And it shows you, by the way, if you listen to this Totentanz, what's missing in his other Liszt recordings from the same period. Next, Debussy. He did quite a bit of Debussy. This is 2 discs worth. Now on Decca, it was on Philips. You have the Berceuse Héroïque, the Image for orchestra, Jeu, and the March, the Marche Écossaise, if that's how you pronounce it. I never knew how to pronounce that. The Scottish March, you know. The Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, the Nocturnes, La Mer, the Clarinet Rhapsody, and the Danse Sacrée et Profane. Well, the performance here that is really, really outstanding is the Nocturnes. It's absolutely one of the most beautiful things he ever did. It got raves, you know, when it first was released on CD. It won all kinds of awards. I think it had a rosette from the Penguin Guide. And it was coupled with Jeu, which was equally fabulous. The La Mer is not quite as good. We're talking about his best performances here. And I would say that for Debussy, go with the Nocturnes. It's really, really terrific. And now, let's see. Oh, yes, of course. Richard Strauss. See, this has the great tone poems, and the great tone poem performance is the one that's not listed on the front. It's Ein Heldenleben. Now, Ein Heldenleben was written for the Concertgebouw. It was dedicated by Strauss to the Concertgebouw in Mengelberg in 1898. And Mengelberg, of course, made 2 recordings of it. The best was actually not his Concertgebouw one. It was his New York Philharmonic one from around, 1929 or something like that, which still sounds surprisingly good. But Haitink and the Concertgebouw just play it wonderfully. You know, it's a piece that suffers from 2 things. One is that it's too long. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. When past the point where you wish it would end, it should end after the battle. But then that's got like 20 minutes more after that. And it's also very bombastic and it's satirical. You can't take it all that seriously. So what are you supposed to do? Keep it light, play it gorgeously, don't dawdle, and just let the orchestra do everything it possibly can to make the best case for the work. And that's exactly what Haitink and the Concertgebouw do in this recording. It is a glorious Ein Heldenleben, and I think a tribute to an orchestra that owns the piece, technically owns the piece. Doesn't mean they've always done the best performance. There's like Reiner in Chicago, you know. But it's a wonderful, wonderful performance. It has a certain proprietary Gemütlichkeit, a comfort in playing the music that's just splendid. So, Haitink and the Concertgebouw for Ein Heldenleben. Next, Ravel. This is maybe one of the most underrated things Haitink ever did. He did 2 discs of Ravel stuff on CD. There were 3 on LP. But then, of course, you see, he did a Haitink. He went to Boston and remade all this stuff. And the remakes were terrible. Just terrible. Not because Boston can't play it, but they were sonically bad. And the performances were just uninteresting compared to these. I think that there was no reason for them. No reason for them to exist at all. You have Bolero, Alborada del Gracioso, Rhapsody Espagnole, La Valse, the Pavane for a Dead Princess, the Valse Noble et Sentimentale, the Minuet Antique, Le Tombeau du Couperin, which is gorgeous, Mother Goose Complete Ballet, and Daphnis and Chloe's Suite Number 2. For my money, I think the one you got to hear is Bolero. I really love his Bolero. I think this is one of the best things he ever did in a piece that everybody does. But it stands out, of course, because of the fabulous solo work of the Concertgebouw, but also because of the way Haitink balances the texture and gets the whole thing to build to the wonderfully explosive ending. It's gorgeously recorded. It has the sound of the Concertgebouw before it became a more international sounding orchestra. You know, the Concertgebouw had some very distinctive tonal characteristics, aside from the woodwinds, which were always amazing. You know, they had this sort of tight but very piercing trombone sound that was quite special. Horns that were more woodwindy than brassy. They weren't like Vienna horns at all. Percussion that was bright and crackling and precise, but timpani that were rich and kind of swimmy sounding. And once Phillips learned how to put bass in its recordings, I mean, boy, did they sound wonderful. Now, this is a Newton Classics 2 CD set, but it was also on Philips or Decca. I'm sure this stuff is out there, then you can find it. But Bolero, listen to the Bolero. For all the things that made Haitink and the Concertgebouw special, you can really hear it in this recording of Bolero. Now, I said at the beginning of this little chat that Haitink was never a Beethoven conductor, particularly, and he wasn't. He wasn't. He didn't have that fire in his belly. It's really that simple, you know, to put Beethoven over with the most, I think, the excitement, the revolutionary fervor, the intensity. And he made a lot of Beethoven recordings, and they were oh so disappointing. A lot of them were anyway. But I think, you know, he redid his Beethoven cycle finally, sort of at the end of his career with the London Symphony. On the LSO's own label. And it was a pretty good Beethoven cycle for the most part. He definitely caught the period instrument bug, and it was all to the good. It meant that his tempi speeded up. It meant that he used brass and timpani with hard sticks that penetrated more. It seemed to supply the edge and the fervor that his earlier Beethoven recordings just didn't have. And the one recording out of that cycle that has totally blown me away and that I can't get over is numbers 4 and 8. Again, it's so like Haitink. 4 and 8 are not the big Beethoven symphonies. They're not the ones that everybody puts their stamp on. But Haitink has. He's done it in these two works specifically. These are as fine a performance of the respective symphonies, 4 and 8, as you will ever hear from anybody, anywhere. He has the LSO playing fabulously. The sonics are really, really good. The Barbican sound isn't too dry, if that's where this was recorded. I have to look at it and see if it was. Yes, it was done at the Barbican, but it sounds quite good. And my, oh my, oh my. What an impressive testament to Haitink's growth as an artist, that at the end of his career, he was able to return to Beethoven and turn in a couple of performances like this that were this level of excellence. So 4 and 8 with the London Symphony, and good for you, Maestro Haitink. Well, we're down to the final two. Yes, Shostakovich. Haitink did a complete Shostakovich cycle, split between the Concertgebouw and the London Phil. The London Phil stuff is not so great. It's not terrible, but it's often not so marvelous. Some of it's okay. Number 15 is very good. But the Concertgebouw recordings are even better. And my vote goes to Symphony number 12. The one that everybody hates, the Shostakovich Symphony that nobody thinks is any good. Haitink and the Concertgebouw play it like it is the greatest piece of music ever written. And it is exciting. It is pedal to the metal, no holds barred, incredibly sensitive in the slow movement, beautifully mysterious and atmospheric. And the last two movements, which are basically trash, I mean, they're Shostakovich at his socialist realist worst, They take them completely seriously and play them for all they're worth and somehow make it work. There are very, very few performances that really deliver this whole symphony with complete commitment and conviction. And again, it was in Haitink's character. He never did anything that he couldn't put his whole self into and get behind if it was a piece of music that needed it. Haitink's problem was the music that didn't need it. He often was slacked off a little bit, I think, because he maybe felt that, it didn't need any special pleading from him. I wish he'd felt otherwise more often, because at the end of the day, everything needs special pleading if that's what you've got to give. And this Shostakovich 12, which is fabulously recorded, it was on Decca originally, is the performance that will turn you on to the piece. If you've never liked it before, if you think it's all garbage, you're never going to like it anyway. But wow, you could admire the performance, the energy, the strength, the musicality, the glowing timbres, the exciting climaxes. It's just marvelous. However, I have to pick my top performance. And the top performance it's got to come, as you probably have already guessed, in the wonderful world of Mahler, because Mahler is a Dutch tradition that began with Mahler and was carried on by Mengelberg. The orchestra has Mahler in their bones, and Haitink inherited that, and his Mahler became more and more, I think, weighty as time went on, and somewhat duller as he kept doing it over and over and over and over. The best performances were all done in the pre-digital Amsterdam days, his best Mahler performances. There was also that live volume of Kirst matinee concerts that people tend to prefer to his studio recordings. Some of them I do, some of them I don't. But we don't have to go into a whole evaluation of his Mahler. My vote for Haitink's best recording, well, maybe it's best recording, but you know what I mean. Just great, great, great recording. And he didn't redo it 150 times. And maybe there was a reason. Das Lied von der Erde, with Janet Baker and James King, two outstanding singers. An incomparable orchestra, beautiful, beautiful recorded sound. The opening of Abschied has never been bettered, never. The sound of the last movement, with those dark low C's and the tam-tam booming in the distance, and the sound of the oboe with the sort of bird call gruppetto motive, da-da-da-da-da, that thing, I don't know. It has ruined the piece for every other performance of it I've ever heard, at least in that moment, which I hope you'll listen to as a sample here of the opening of Abschied. My God, it is so atmospheric and idiomatic and somehow right. And that's true of this whole performance. It has a rightness about it, a sense of inevitability that really reveals Haitink at his best. And he's got two great singers, and you will never find a better performance of Das Lied von der Erde. It is also, I think, probably fitting that this is just such a collaborative effort. A real collaboration between Haitink, the two singers, the orchestra, everybody in their top form, everybody completely subsumed with giving their very best on behalf of the music itself, which is really what Haitink stood for. He was not the kind of showman who was going to interject his personality into everything that he did. He was the kind of guy who wanted to disappear into the music and let the music itself come out and grab you. And in this Das Lied von der Erde, boy, does it do that. So those are my 10 greatest recordings by Bernard Haitink, I'm sure you'll have your own, but I think that if you're looking to get the best of him, or to start a collection, or to just memorialize his artistry, these performances will really do you very, very well. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Take care.